Have you ever walked into a place and instantly felt like you didn't belong? Not because you did anything wrong, but because of the way people looked at you. The way their silence spoke louder than words, "You shouldn't be here." Marcus Ellery knows that feeling better than anyone. A federal agent, a black man. After a long assignment, all he wanted was a quiet corner at Maple and Grain to sip a cup of coffee and type up a report. But sometimes, with your skin color and the way you look, simply sitting still can be taken as a challenge. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The looks on their faces had already written the story for him. This man doesn't belong here. And then the cafe door opened. A police officer walked in, no greeting, no asking names. He just looked at Marcus and ordered, "You need to leave." Marcus stayed silent, not because he accepted it, but because he knew this wasn't the first time he'd been silently judged, and it wouldn't be the last. He just wanted peace. To be left alone. To be human without having to prove anything. But, sometimes, just to have a seat. You're forced to carry the weight of a story others have written for you. And then, with one small move, one card, Marcus made the entire cafe and that confident officer fall silent. A silence not just for him, but for millions who've been looked through as if they didn't exist. If you've ever felt that way, share this story. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that make us reflect on how we see one another, hit subscribe and stay with us. And this is how it began, in a small cafe, on an afternoon that seemed so ordinary. 30 minutes. That's all Marcus Ellery thought he needed. 30 minutes to sip a cappuccino, edit a few lines of a report, and give his brain a breather before another long, grueling day. He stepped into Maple and Grain Cafe, a boutique coffee shop downtown where everything seemed carefully curated for piece-polished wood counters, warm, amber pendant lights, artistic black and white photos perfectly aligned on the walls. But that kind of peace, Marcus knew, wasn't for everyone. He wore a simple gray suit, no tie, carrying a slim laptop, a look that fit right in at a DC conference, but here, it made him an outlier. He didn't try to draw attention, but in places like this, he didn't need to do anything to become the center of it. 25 minutes left. Marcus ordered a cappuccino. His voice was deep, calm. The young barista gave him a quick, polite smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes before turning away. Coffee in hand. Marcus walked to a corner table by the window, where the sunlight stretched across the wood like an island of quiet. This would be his spot, his little corner to disappear into his work. But Marcus didn't disappear. He never could. The moment he sat down, he felt the eyes, not intense, not lingering, but everywhere. The blonde woman pretending to adjust her purse, sneaking a glance. The old man lowering his paper just enough to look over the edge. Their eyes didn't speak, but Marcus heard the story anyway. You don't belong here. 20 minutes left. He opened his laptop, set his pen beside it, and put on his headphones without playing any music. An invisible wall. A practiced ritual of survival, look busy. Leave no opening for anyone to engage. Outside the window, the town's streets looked calm. But inside the cafe, the air thickened as if his presence had disturbed some unspoken order. 15 minutes left. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness rolling across his tongue. He didn't need to look up to know he was being watched. He'd lived with this feeling his whole life. You don't have to do anything wrong to be judged. Sometimes existing is enough. 10 minutes left. Just stay quiet, he told himself. Get your work done and leave. But deep down, he knew the stares rarely stop at just staring. 5 minutes left. And right on cue, the cafe door swung open, the soft chime of the bell. A tall figure in a police uniform stepped in. His eyes swept the room. and stopped on Marcus. Turns out, the calm before the storm only lasted about 25 minutes. And if Marcus had known what was about to happen, maybe he would have stood up and left right then. But he didn't know, and neither should you, because this is only the beginning. 4 minutes. Officer Dean Harker walked into Maple and Grain like he owned the place. The door closed behind him, and with just the sound of his boots on the wood floor, he commanded the room. No nods, no polite greetings. Dean didn't need them. He wore a uniform, and in towns like this, a uniform was power enough. His eyes swept the counter, lingered a beat on the barista, then moved across the tables. When they landed on Marcus, they stayed there, long enough for Marcus to understand the game had begun. 3 minutes. Dean approached the counter, speaking low to the barista. Marcus couldn't hear, but the kid's quick, nervous glance toward him said everything. Dean nodded. Didn't order coffee, didn't grab a pastry. He turned and walked straight toward the table by the window. "You waiting on someone?" Dean asked. The tone wasn't loud, but Marcus had heard that tone his whole life. Accusation, dressed up as civility. Marcus looked up, calm and steady. "No, I'm working." Dean didn't acknowledge the answer. His eyes flicked to the laptop, then to the coffee cup. "This isn't a free seating area." Marcus gestured to his cup. "I paid for it." 2 minutes. Silence, heavy, deliberate. If it were someone else, maybe they'd pack up and leave. But Marcus didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, his calm now a quiet act of defiance. Dean stood there, hands resting on his belt, not threatening, but not relaxed either. Anyone watching knew this wasn't a conversation. This was a test, and Marcus was the one being tested. 1 minute? "You've been sitting here a while," Dean said. "People are uncomfortable." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Did someone complain to you?" Dean said nothing, which was an answer in itself. Marcus knew this script. He'd been in this play his whole life. Stares become questions. Questions become accusations. And he always had to prove he wasn't a threat just to be left alone. This wasn't dialogue. It was a trial, and the verdict was already written. No minutes left. Marcus took a slow breath, set his coffee down, and met Dean's gaze. "I have the same right to sit here as anyone else." His voice was even, clear, not raised, not lowered. And just like that, Maple and Grain fell so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. No one left. No one spoke, because everyone knew this wasn't ending with words. And if you think this is just a simple back and forth, stay with me, because the turn that's coming, you won't see it coming. 90 seconds. That's all it takes for a quiet cafe to turn into a stage strung tight with tension. Dean drew in a deep breath, like a man preparing to pass judgment, then said, "You need to leave." No explanation. No questions. Just a command, spoken in that voice people in uniform used to hide fragility behind authority. 80 seconds. Marcus didn't move. He leaned back slightly, hands resting loosely on the table. If this was chess, he'd just declared he wasn't playing by Dean's rules. "What did I do wrong?" he asked. A simple question, but it froze the whole cafe, because everyone knew the answer, and that's exactly why no one dared speak it out loud. 70 seconds. Dean's hand tightened on his belt, a small gesture, but it carried the entire arsenal of implied threat. It said he could take this wherever he wanted, behind the counter. The barista shrank into himself, eyes darting away like if he didn't look at the scene, it might disappear. The blonde woman near the door pressed her lips together, scrolling aimlessly on her phone without sending a single message. 60 seconds. The air thickened. Dean stood like a wall, blocking every exit. Marcus kept his calm gaze, but inside, A flood of old memories came knocking the times he'd been asked to prove he belonged in luxury hotels. The times he'd been followed in stores. His wallet heavier than the men tailing him. And now, in a small cafe, it was happening again. 50 seconds. "You didn't hear me?" Dean said. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed like a nail hammered into the table. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee, dragging out the silence. "I heard you, but I still haven't heard a reason." 40 seconds. That wasn't an answer. It was a mirror. Marcus held it up, forcing Dean to look at the absurdity of his own words, and no one in that cafe could escape that reflection. 30 seconds. Dean glanced around, as if searching for an ally among the silent patrons. No one spoke. Those who'd been watching now seemed carved from stone, unwilling to take a side, but unable to look away. 20 seconds. Marcus set his cup down slowly, never breaking eye contact. If my presence makes people uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't me. 10 seconds. A simple statement, but it hung there like a dull blade cutting deep into the pride of an entire town. No seconds? Dean opened his mouth to respond, but in that exact moment when every eye in the cafe locked on him and no one stepped up in support, everything shifted. Because sometimes, one well-timed question can shake an entire wall of authority. But you haven't seen the real turn yet. What Marcus was about to do would be burned into Dean's memory forever. 90 seconds. That's how long Marcus gave Dean to pull himself out of the hole he'd dug, but Dean didn't know he was standing at the edge, or maybe he was just too used to always winning. "You need to leave," Dean repeated. The same voice. The same tone, the voice of a man who thought his presence was justification enough. 80 seconds. Marcus didn't reply. Instead, he moved slowly. His hand slid into his jacket. Every eye in the cafe tracked the motion. No one said it, but everyone imagined the worst. Dean stiffened, hands on his belt, ready. 70 seconds. But Marcus didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a black leather wallet, edges worn soft from years of use. He set it on the table and flipped it open. 60 seconds. No one breathed. Time froze as sunlight from the window caught on the metallic glint inside. The words engraved there silenced the entire room, Federal Bureau of Investigation. 50 seconds. Dean froze. His hands, once braced on his belt, fell heavy at his sides. The posture of power he'd worn a minute ago crumbled into the stance of a man caught in the act. 40 seconds. A woman near the counter whispered to her friend, "He hasn't even raised his voice." The words carried across the cafe like a reminder real power doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it's knowing exactly when to break the silence. 30 seconds. Dean swallowed hard. "You." The word agent stuck in his throat like a stone. He couldn't finish, but he couldn't walk away either. 20 seconds. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. The badge on the table spoke for him. It didn't just answer the question of who he was. It forced Dean to see himself exposed, small, and stripped of his borrowed authority. 10 seconds. Dean inhaled, trying to reclaim whatever dignity he could. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice unsteady. No seconds. Marcus closed the wallet with deliberate calm. He didn't look at Dean again. He just lifted his cup and took another sip, like the conversation had never happened, and that unbothered stillness cut deeper than any raised voice could. Because sometimes what terrifies people most isn't shouting. It's absolute, unshakable composure. But if you think Dean walked out with his lesson learned, you're wrong. Wait, what he did next will show you exactly what happens when someone's used to standing at the top. 1 minute. That's how long it had been since Dean walked out of Maple and Grain when Janelle Ruiz's phone buzzed softly. She'd been sitting in the corner the whole time, pretending to be busy with work emails but actually recording everything that had just happened. Not because she was a reporter, Janelle was a high school teacher, a single mom, just hoping for a few quiet minutes in the middle of a long day. But something deep down told her what just happened shouldn't disappear like a breath in a silent room. 50 seconds. Janelle opened her photo gallery. The video was under 2 minutes long, but it had everything Dean's cold stare as he walked in. The loaded "you" waiting for someone the moment Marcus opened his wallet, and the silence that hung heavy as that badge came into view. No shouting, no scuffle. But everything in it demanded people sit up straight. 40 seconds. Her thumb hovered over the share button. For a moment, she paused, as if asking herself whether she was throwing a stranger into a storm. Then she typed. He did nothing, but had to prove who he was just to be left alone. It wasn't just a caption. It was the perfect summary of too many of her students' lives, too many of her colleagues' experiences. 30 seconds. She tapped post, no hashtags, no filters, no location tags. Just a single tap, like millions of other forgettable taps on social media. But Janelle had no idea she'd just set off a fuse. 20 seconds. While Marcus sipped his coffee and plugged in his headphones to finish his work, the video began to spread. A few of Janelle's friends shared it. Then their friends. Comments started to appear. This is why we record. Another. He wasn't respected as a man, only as someone with a badge. The words were gasoline on dry wood. 10 seconds. Janelle locked her phone and exhaled, thinking she'd just lifted a weight off her shoulders. But as she stood to leave, she didn't know that the clip wouldn't die in obscurity like millions of others. It would live. And it would force this town, maybe even the country, to face a question they'd been avoiding. No seconds? Because some videos don't need special effects or big climaxes. They exist for one purpose: to hold up a mirror to society. And what came next would teach Marcus that silence can echo louder than screams. 1 hour. That's how long it took for a 2-minute clip to break out of a small-town bubble and enter the roaring current of the internet. In 60 minutes, the shares grew from a few dozen to hundreds, then thousands. Accounts Janelle had never heard of began adding their voices. This is why we record. He wasn't respected as a human, only as someone with federal credentials. 50 minutes. A local news page reposted the clip with a biting headline, "Customer or Suspect Tense Moment at Maple and Grain Café." And just like that, the media valve burst open. Reporters chasing stories on racial bias pounced on it like vultures on fresh prey. 40 minutes. The comments weren't just angry, they were cutting. "Maybe we should all start printing badges on our shirts," one person joked. "Turns out, to be seen as legitimate, you have to work for the feds," another added. Sarcasm spreads faster than outrage. It makes the anger easier to share and more dangerous. 30 minutes. A well-known account in the teacher community reposted the clip with the caption, "This is the lesson I teach my students daily. Silence isn't always safe." A civil rights attorney chimed in, "See, this your humanity still needs a card to defend it." Their words pushed the story further from a small-town cafe to national forums. 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea. He was still sitting in the cafe corner, laptop open, finishing his report before heading back to his hotel. But outside that screen, his life was becoming a symbol. He hadn't chosen the role. The internet had chosen it for him. 10 minutes. Now, the video no longer belonged to Janelle or Marcus. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in it, in that unspoken question. What are you doing here? In those countless moments when they had to prove they weren't a threat just to exist in public. No minutes. And if you think the internet only remembers stories with shouting matches and dramatic endings, wait. Because a silent video can sometimes spark a louder conversation than any shouting ever could, and Marcus was about to learn that in a way no one could prepare him for. 12 hours. That's when the clip hit 1 million views, turning into a talking point everywhere, from local Facebook groups to national news outlets. But Marcus Ellery still didn't know. He was back at his hotel, a generic 2-bedroom on the edge of town, the kind designed to be forgotten as soon as you leave. A yellow lamp cast a dull glow on gray walls. The air conditioner droned steadily, lulling the exhausted. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, hands braced on his thighs, as if carrying the weight of the entire day. 11 hours. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from coworkers, unknown numbers, even missed calls. Marcus flipped it over. "Are you the man in this video? You were so calm, so inspiring. Would you be willing to do an interview?" He turned the phone face down. 10 hours? He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel happy. He just felt a familiar ache, an old one. I still have to prove my right to exist. Only this time, it wasn't about surviving a moment in a café. This time, it was about proving himself to millions of strangers. 9 hours. Marcus stared into the mirror. A calm face stared back, hiding the battle the internet had turned into a spectacle. People were calling him a symbol of restraint, a man who taught the world a lesson in composure. But Marcus knew the truth. This wasn't a lesson. It was survival. He hadn't chosen to be a symbol. He'd just done what he had to do, not to be crushed. 8 hours. He opened his laptop, not to read the headlines, but to finish the report he'd started at Maple and Grain. Numbers and data helped him drown out the storm outside. But in the back of his mind, the words still echoed. He wasn't respected as a man, only as someone with a badge. 7 hours. Marcus shut the laptop and lay back on the bed. He thought of Janelle's students, watching the clip and recognizing their own reflection in it. He thought of Dean, frozen next to his patrol car, maybe now writing his own incident report with trembling hands. 6 hours. The phone buzzed again. Marcus didn't reach for it. He didn't want to be a hero, didn't want interviews, didn't want to become a story. He just wanted to be left alone. No hours. But peace wasn't coming back, because the internet hadn't just taken his story. It was about to weaponize it for a debate Marcus couldn't escape. And this was only the beginning. 200 a.m. Dean Harker sat alone in his dark living room, the only light coming from the cold blue glow of his phone screen. The wall clock ticked steadily. But to Dean, each tick slammed into his skull. He rewound the clip, the same video that now the whole town, maybe the whole country, had seen. He tried to reassure himself. I followed procedure. I did exactly what I was trained to do. He whispered it like a prayer, a mantra meant to soothe his own mind. But his body refused to calm down. His palms were slick with sweat, the back of his neck icy. 48 hours ago, Dean believed he knew right from wrong. Now, everything felt upside down. 1:45 a.m. His eyes locked on that moment when Marcus opened his wallet and flipped the badge into view. Each time he replayed it, the shame burrowed deeper, not just because Marcus was a federal agent, but because in that moment, Dean saw himself clearly, a man who hadn't asked, only judged. He'd convinced himself he was following protocol, but really, he was following instinct. He's different, so he's a problem. 1:50 a.m. Dean set the phone down and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't drink it. His hand trembled, the glass quivering against the counter. Marcus's words echoed in his head. You didn't ask. You just assumed. It cut like a dull blade, not sharp enough to bleed, but deep enough to ache. 1:55 a.m. He tried to justify himself. I was just doing my job. Someone reported a suspicious person. But then came the question he couldn't escape: if it had been a white man, wearing the same clothes, sitting at the same table, would I have walked up and asked that Dean hated how quickly he knew the answer. 2:00 a.m. Sharp. Dean paced the small living room, his eyes landing on the neatly pressed uniform hanging on the rack, the polished shoes beneath it. That uniform had once made him proud. Tonight, it looked like a mask that let him believe he was protecting the community when in truth, last night, he had forced a citizen to prove he was legitimate enough to drink a cup of coffee. He collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. He had never felt time drag this slowly. The small room suddenly felt like a jail cell, and he was the prisoner sentenced by his own conscience. No seconds left. And if Dean thought the nightmare would end when he turned off the screen, he was wrong. Because what waited for him tomorrow wasn't just a public outrage, it was a reckoning with who he really was. 1:45 a.m. Dean still hadn't put the phone down, but now he wasn't replaying the clip, he was rewinding himself. He remembered a winter night 2 years ago when he pulled over an old car on the outskirts of town because the driver looked off. It was a young black man in a hoodie, heading home from a late shift. Dean wrote in his report, suspicious behavior, failure to maintain lane. But the truth, Dean hadn't seen suspicious behavior, just dark skin in a beat-up car. 1:30 a.m. He remembered a summer afternoon, patrolling a public park with his partner. They came across a group of brown-skinned teens sitting on the grass. Dean walked up and demanded to search their bags. Nothing illegal, just confused faces and quiet, restrained anger. The report that day read, "Routine patrol, no incidents." What it didn't say, his reflex acted long before his reasoning. 1:15 a.m. Dean kept flipping through these moments, like pulling dusty files from a cabinet in his head. A pattern emerged. Every time he followed procedure. It was when he saw someone who didn't look like him, someone who didn't fit his idea of normal. Procedure, he realized, was a shield, a way to hide an instinct he'd never truly questioned. This person might be a threat because I feel like they are. 1:00 a.m. His eyes drifted back to the uniform. It felt heavier than ever. All the training sessions, all the speeches about community and justice now sounded like a pretty curtain hiding what he was slowly admitting. He'd acted on bias far more than he'd ever wanted to believe. 12:45 a.m. He poured another glass of water, but didn't drink it. The reflection in the glass stared back at him older, wearier, and stripped of excuses. It wasn't just the system with a problem, it was him. 12:30 a.m. He pressed his elbows to his knees and buried his face in his hands. In the silence, one truth became unavoidable. What he called doing the job by the book had been an excuse to avoid asking hard questions about himself. He'd worn that badge for so long. He'd stopped checking if there was still a human being underneath it. No minutes left. And if Dean thought those ghosts would stay buried in memory, he was wrong, because once the internet names you, those ghosts don't just haunt, they get dragged into the light for everyone to examine. 30 minutes later, Dean still sat frozen. But now, in front of him wasn't a glass of water, it was his phone screen, fully lit. The news had reached him, not through whispers from colleagues or calls from supervisors, but through headlines, blunt and merciless. Officer Harker suspended for profiling. Dean read it slowly, as if his brain needed time to process that it was his name in the headline. There were hundreds of comments below the article. He didn't read them all, just the first few. Serves him right. At least someone's finally being held accountable. If it weren't for that badge, he'd be the one in handcuffs. Dean let out a dry laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was the only sound left when all the excuses had run out. 20 minutes. He muttered to himself, "They told me to trust my instincts." He'd heard it over and over from academy instructors. from veteran officers. "Trust your gut. It'll keep you alive. It'll lead you right." Dean leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Turns out," he said, his voice flat, "my gut was teaching me the wrong lesson." 15 minutes? Sarcasm had never tasted so bitter. That instinct he'd been proud of, the thing he thought made him a good cop, was now public proof that he was part of the problem. He'd thought he was protecting order. In reality, he'd been reinforcing an order where men like Marcus were guilty until proven otherwise. 10 minutes. His phone kept buzzing, a call from a coworker, then his brother from out of state. Dean didn't pick up. He had no idea what to say. "I got suspended for doing exactly what I was taught." Or worse, "I got suspended for doing exactly what I've become." 5 minutes. Dean stared out the window. His faint reflection stared back, blurred in the glass. He thought of all the community engagement trainings he'd written off as pointless. He thought of the promises of justice for all. They all felt like a cruel joke now. No minutes. Dean wondered if that video hadn't gone viral. Would I have ever realized? Or would I still be rocking myself to sleep with the same lie that my instincts were always right, that I was one of the good guys in uniform? And if Dean thought the lesson ended here, he was wrong, because the real lesson wouldn't play out in this dark living room. It would play out in front of a community waiting for him to answer. 7:00 p.m. The town's community center was packed. Gray plastic chairs were lined up neatly, but no amount of order could contain the tension rising in waves. Dean Harker hadn't arrived. Neither had Marcus Ellery, but the stories had already begun not on the stage, but from the rows of chairs below. 60 minutes earlier, a middle-aged woman stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "My son was stopped on his way home just for wearing a hoodie. He's 14. She swallowed hard, glancing around the room before adding, "They say it's to protect the community. But protect who, and protect us from what?" Murmurs filled the room, not in protest, in agreement. 50 minutes earlier, an old man leaning on a cane spoke next. "I've been followed in grocery stores," he rasped. "I served in the military. I wore the uniform so people would believe I belonged to this country. Now I'm an old man, just trying to buy milk, and I still have to prove I belong in the store." 40 minutes earlier. The stories piled up, voices stacking over one another like old wounds reopening. A college student talked about being asked to show ID while studying in the park. A father spoke about police being called on him for waiting for his wife outside a supermarket. Each story was a puzzle piece of the same picture in this town. Some people always had to prove they had the right to exist. 30 minutes earlier. No one shouted. No one slammed their fists. But the silence between stories said more than noise ever could. It was the silence of people who had lived it, and those who were only just realizing they lived in a town with two sets of rules, one for those who belong, and one for those always asked, "What are you doing here?" 20 minutes earlier. Janelle Ruiz, the woman who filmed the video, stood up. "I recorded that moment because I know what it feels like to be doubted just for being who I am," she said, "and I don't want my child to grow up thinking that's normal." Applause followed. Not thunderous, but steady. Sustained. 10 minutes earlier. A town official stepped up to the stage, holding a microphone. "This isn't just a meeting," he said. "This is a moment to face the truth." But even he knew the truth wasn't just on paper. It was sitting out there, in the eyes of people who'd grown used to being stared at like suspects. No minutes left. And if anyone thought this meeting would end in polite promises, they were wrong. Because there was one person who had to walk out before this crowd, and this time, no uniform could shield him. 45 minutes earlier. Marcus Ellery sat in the last row. The hard plastic chair bit into his back like the cold tension in the room. He wasn't wearing his work suit, just a dark shirt and khakis. No one looked at him. Or maybe they were pretending not to. Marcus preferred it that way. He hadn't come to speak. He came to listen. 40 minutes earlier, a woman in the middle rows rose to speak. Her voice wavered, but her gaze stayed fixed. I have a 15-year-old son. He's black, taller than his friends. Every time he goes out at night, I stay awake until I hear the door open. Not because I don't trust him, because I don't trust the eyes out there to see him as a child. She paused. He's just a boy. But to them, what is he a threat? The room hummed with whispers. A few heads nodded. Marcus stared at his hands, holding back the familiar ache. He knew that fear. He had been that boy. 35 minutes earlier, an elderly man stood, a faded military jacket draped over his shoulders like a relic. I once carried the flag on my back, he said. I thought that uniform protected me from suspicion. 2 months ago, a young officer stopped me walking home from the store. I was in uniform, my medals on my chest, and he still asked me, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" He laughed a hollow, bitter laugh. Maybe I need a new badge to prove I'm allowed to exist. The room went still, not for lack of words, but because everyone understood. 30 minutes earlier, Marcus clenched his hands on his knees. None of these stories surprised him. They were mirrors reflecting the same moments he'd lived being asked for ID, even after swiping his federal badge, feeling the stares when entering spaces not meant for him. He had come to listen, but he realized he was listening to his own life. 20 minutes earlier, a young man, maybe a student, spoke from the corner. Have we ever asked why we have to prove we deserve to exist? Why no one has to prove they deserve to doubt us? 10 minutes earlier, Marcus scanned the room. Faces tightened from holding in years of stories, eyes tired but unbowed. He said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew silence sometimes carried farther than a speech. No minutes left. And if you think Marcus's silence was avoidance, wait, because sometimes silence is how you let the weight of others' words settle right before the real storm hits. 20 minutes earlier, when it seemed the stories had wrung the room dry, a thin but steady voice came from the very back. It wasn't an adult. It was a boy, 11, maybe 12. He stood close to his mother, his small hands clutching the hem of her shirt. She had just spoken of fearing for her son at night, but what she hadn't said. He said, for her, how do I make them stop thinking I'm bad, just because I look like my dad? 15 minutes earlier, the room, once buzzing, went dead silent. No whispers, no shifting chairs, just a question hanging in the stale air one adults like to think they can always answer. Marcus dropped his gaze. The question wasn't for him, but it cut through to a memory he kept buried. He saw his mother at the window, waiting for him to come home. Her relief mixed with anger when he was late. You can't just wander around. Not everyone will see you as safe. That boy had just asked what Marcus had never been able to answer for himself. 10 minutes earlier, no one spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because they knew the truth. There was no answer here. Averted gazes, white-knuckled hands, long sighs. All quiet admissions that the adults had failed, that a child had to ask this at all. 5 minutes earlier, a man tried to break the tension with a joke. Just study hard, get successful, and they'll respect you. But no one laughed. Not even him. He knew his words sounded like a sentence that the boy had to become good enough just to be seen as human. Marcus lifted his eyes, locking on the boy. He wanted to say, "You don't have to earn your right to exist," but he stayed quiet, in this room, filled with stories of bag searches, traffic stops, and suspicious stares. That sentence would sound like an empty comfort. No minutes left. The boy's question hung there, like a red warning light. How do I make them stop thinking I'm bad? It wasn't just for those in uniform, it was for the whole town, the whole country. And if you think that question would just fade into silence, wait. Because someone was about to face it not with excuses, but with their presence. 4 Yuzuru p.m. Marcus Ellery sat in a café near his hotel, one he chose simply because fewer people there would recognize him from Maple and Grain. He'd ordered a black coffee, untouched, staring out at the street. He'd learned how to make himself small, pick a corner, keep his back to the wall, eyes alert enough to observe but not enough to invite conversation. 3:50 p.m. Jasper arrived, walking with the same familiar gait of someone who was never in a rush, yet never late. His wrinkled blazer and weathered leather satchel made it clear he'd spent the day buried in his university office. Jasper had been Marcus's classmate at Towson, now a sociology professor. If anyone understood how the world saw Marcus, it was Jasper. "You're a symbol now," Jasper said as soon as he sat down. No greeting. Jasper didn't waste words. 3:55 p.m. Marcus smirked faintly. "I don't want to be." His voice was low, rough, as if he wanted to cut the conversation off before it began. Jasper tilted his head, studying Marcus like a thesis. "I know, but no one asked if you wanted to be. That video did the asking for you." Marcus closed his eyes for a few seconds, swallowing his frustration. He didn't want to snap at Jasper, the one person who spoke to him without that hushed, pitying tone people used it with victims. "Jasper," Marcus said slowly, "I just want to work. I don't want to be some poster for a movement." 3:55 p.m. Jasper laughed, humorless. "You think the people in that room yesterday needed a poster, they needed a face, a story. And now you are that story." Marcus clenched his hands, staring at the untouched coffee. "I didn't ask for this role." "No one does," Jasper replied, leaning forward. "But do you know how many people saw themselves in that moment you put your wallet on the table? You said nothing, but you spoke for them." 3:50 p.m. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "I just want peace. Just once." Jasper nodded slowly. "Peace is a privilege. Marcus, you know that better than anyone." Marcus lifted his gaze, meeting Jasper's eyes. They weren't accusatory, but they didn't let him hide either. "No time left." Marcus took a sip of the bitter coffee. He knew Jasper was right, but accepting that meant stepping out of the shadow of silence into a place where every eye was waiting for him to answer the boy's question from last night. And Marcus wasn't sure he was ready. Jasper didn't look away. "You don't need to be loud," he said evenly. "Not comforting, not condemning. Your quiet already spoke for millions." Marcus gave a short, dry laugh. "Quiet, Jasper. I just wanted coffee. I wasn't sending a message." "That's the point," Jasper shot back. "You didn't have to try. You sat there, calm, and were treated like a threat. Then you put down that wallet. That's all. And you exposed the whole machine. Respect didn't come from you being a man, it came from the badge. People saw that. They heard it. Your silence was louder than a shout." Marcus leaned back, silent. He replayed the faces from that day, the blonde woman pretending to scroll her phone, the old man lowering his newspaper just to watch, the nervous barista behind the counter. All of them witnessed it. All of them understood, yet no one spoke. That silence had once made Marcus feel abandoned. Now Jasper claimed it had become his voice. "You're romanticizing this," Marcus muttered, trying to steer the talk back to safer ground. Jasper shook his head. "No. I'm explaining why that video didn't sink like a million others. It didn't just capture an awkward moment. It showed a truth being human wasn't enough. Having a title was. You didn't need to yell to make people see it. You just had to sit there." Marcus stared down at the cup. He'd never thought of silence carrying that kind of weight. For him, silence was survival, make yourself small, the least threatening version of yourself. But now Jasper was telling him that very silence had become evidence, a statement with his signature all over it. "You know what's funny," Jasper said, smirking. "You worked so hard to stay out of the spotlight, and that's exactly what put you in it." Marcus sighed. "I don't want to be in the spotlight." "No one does," Jasper shrugged. "But sometimes society chooses someone to hold up as a mirror. This week, that someone is you." Marcus bit his lip. He knew Jasper was right. The irony stung a lifetime spent trying not to be seen as a threat undone by one small gesture. Opening his wallet, showing his badge, and now people were calling it heroic. He looked at Jasper, ready to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. If Marcus thought silence could bury this story, Jasper had made one thing clear: he no longer had that luxury. Because once silence roars like thunder, the world won't let you stay quiet for long. Marcus stayed seated, quiet like a man cornered who hadn't yet decided whether to fight or flee. But Jasper didn't leave. He knew when to wait. He knew exactly how long to wait for Marcus to speak first. "Maybe," Marcus said slowly, "it's time I say something." Jasper raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Not for me," Marcus continued, eyes fixed on a coffee stain on the table. I have that badge. It's like a shield. But what about the people who don't? That boy at the meeting yesterday? Or the ones who get stared down every day without anyone filming it, if I stay quiet? Who speaks for them?" Jasper nodded, the faintest smile breaking his serious face. Marcus leaned back, letting out a long exhale. "It's absurd. Jasper, I spent my whole life trying not to be the story. I chose silence because I thought silence was safe. And now that silence made me the story one I can't control." Jasper placed his hand on the table, his tone sharp. "And you're going to let others tell that story for you, Marcus. Silence is a choice when you're free. But when millions are projecting meaning onto your silence, you've already lost that choice." Marcus bit down on his lip. He wasn't one for stages or microphones, but the image of that boy at the meeting clung to him. "How do I make them stop thinking I'm bad just because I look like my dad?" No one had answered him. Marcus knew even if he stepped up, he wouldn't have a perfect answer. But at least that question wouldn't hang in the air another day. He looked at Jasper. "If I do this, I won't do it to explain myself. I'll do it for the ones who never got the chance to open a wallet and prove they belong." Jasper finally smiled, genuine this time. That's the Marcus I know, not loud, but never hiding. Marcus nodded, exhaling. He didn't know what he'd say, or where, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't stay silent. And if Marcus thought speaking up was just about saying a few words, he was about to find out once he opened his mouth. The whole town, maybe the whole country, would be listening. 7 Husru p.m. The doors of the community center creaked open, and Dean Harker walked in. He wasn't in uniform. For the first time in years, Dean appeared in public without the blue shield that had always guarded him. Just a plain white shirt, gray slacks, a loose tie, and a face that couldn't hide the exhaustion etched into it. He'd thought dressing down would make him seem more approachable. In truth, it only made him look exposed. 60 minutes earlier, Dean had been sitting in his car in the parking lot, hands clamped on the steering wheel so long he couldn't remember when he'd gripped it. He told himself, "This is just a meeting. They'll talk. I'll listen." But even he didn't believe it. This wasn't a meeting. It was a trial one convened by the town, and by his own conscience. He stepped inside, and the room fell silent. 50 minutes earlier, Dean froze at the doorway. This silence was different from the one he used to control rooms during his patrols. This was the silence of a crowd staring at someone they knew exactly who he was, the man who had forced them to reopen old wounds. 40 minutes earlier, he walked forward, each step feeling twice as long. Plastic chairs creaked as a few people adjusted themselves to get a better look. Dean avoided the front row. He didn't want to see if Marcus Ellery was sitting there, or that boy with the eyes that had silenced the entire room the night before. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor. 30 minutes earlier, Dean sat in the chair reserved for the speaker. The plastic backrest felt cold against him, but the back of his neck burned under the weight of dozens of stares. He waited for someone, a moderator, a town official, anyone to break the tension, but no one rushed to rescue him. They left him sitting there in the very silence he once used against others, silence he could no longer command. 20 minutes earlier, a woman coughed softly, the sound cracking like a starter's pistol. All eyes snapped to Dean. No yelling, no curses. And that, he realized, was worse than any loud confrontation. These people hadn't come to vent. They'd come to look him in the eye and demand answers. 10 minutes earlier, Dean drew a breath, but his throat tightened. He'd prepared the proper lines: apologies, explanations, promises to do better. But looking into these faces, he knew none of those words could bridge the chasm between them and him. No time left, and if Dean thought the hardest part would be facing their silence, he was about to learn the hardest part wasn't being seen. It was speaking the truth he'd been avoiding. Dean sat there, feeling every stare like a stone on his shoulders. He waited for the storm, waited for the shouting, the accusations, waited for someone to stand and call him the word every article had already used, but nothing came. 60 seconds, silence. The kind of silence that made all his pre-written excuses, "I'm sorry if anyone felt hurt," seem pointless. No one interrupted him. No one heckled him. No one gave him the out of playing the contrite cop. 50 seconds. Dean scanned the room. They weren't speaking, but their faces demanded answers. The mother who had cried talking about her son. The veteran stopped despite his uniform. The boy who asked the question no one dared answer. They were all waiting for him. 40 seconds. Dean felt suffocated, as though he'd been dragged to the center of the room and forced to stand naked in front of a mirror. He heard his own heartbeat. He even heard the scratch of a reporter's pencil in the corner. 30 seconds. He swallowed hard. The polished apologies, "I regret if my actions were misinterpreted," now felt worthless. He knew what they wanted wasn't a statement. It was the truth. And this time, there was no uniform to hide behind. Dean inhaled deeply. His voice rasped, but he kept going. "I didn't ask. I just assumed. And I was wrong." 20 seconds. A chair squeaked. A woman crossed her arms, tilting her head. No applause, no gasps, but Dean felt it, the shift in the room. They'd heard what they were waiting for. Not a defense, an admission. 10 seconds. Dean continued. "Unprompted, I believed my instincts were right. I thought I was just doing my job, but I understand now what I called instinct was just my comfort coming at the expense of someone else's safety." He paused, staring at the floor. "And I need to do better. Not just when people are watching, but when no one is." Time's up. And if Dean thought saying the truth was the hardest part, he was about to learn the real challenge was staying put while the room decided whether to believe him. 10 seconds passed. No one moved. Dean almost wished someone would yell, hurl an insult, anything to break the suffocating stillness. But no. They left him in the void between confession and judgment. Then a sound broke through. Not a protest, applause. A gray-haired woman in the middle row clapped her hands slow, deliberate. Others joined in. The applause spread, but it wasn't loud or triumphant. It wasn't the sound for a hero, nor was it the sound for a man forgiven. It was the knock of a door. "We hear you. Now you hear us." Dean looked up, scanning the faces. No one smiled. They clapped without softening their expressions, as if to say, "We don't forgive, we don't forget. But at least you said what should have been said long ago." The applause stopped as abruptly as it began. Then a man in the back row spoke. "So what now?" "Officer, what are you going to do differently?" Dean's throat tightened. He realized the apology was the easy part. The hard part was sitting there, listening to the people he'd ignored, the ones he'd hurt, the ones he'd turned into suspects, as they told him what they really thought. A young father stood. "You say you'll do better. Great. But how many times do we have to hear that before we believe it?" Bitter laughter rippled through the crowd, the laughter of people who'd heard too many promises. An older woman raised her hand, her eyes locked on Dean. "Would you even be here if there wasn't a video? Or are you only brave when the camera leaves you no choice?" Dean's neck burned. He understood this wasn't an apology session. It was a reckoning. And they weren't just demanding better from him, they were demanding it from the entire system that trained a Dean Harker to assume first and ask later. He drew a steadying breath, meeting their eyes. "I won't ask you to believe me tonight," Dean said, voice low but firm. "I'll only ask for the chance to prove it." The room went quiet again. And if Dean thought this was the end of his trial, he was wrong. Because from this moment on, he wasn't just the one under scrutiny, he was the one being watched. And their judgment wouldn't end in this room. 8:00 p.m. The town's community center was still packed. No one leaving after Dean vacated the hot seat. The air hung heavy, as if everyone knew this meeting wasn't done. The moderator hesitated for a beat before inviting Marcus Ellery to the podium. Marcus rose, each step toward the stage like a private negotiation with himself. He wasn't used to being a speaker. He didn't want to be a hero. But he knew every eye in that room, from the anxious parents to the boy who had posed that lingering question the night before, was waiting for him. 7 minutes ago. Marcus rested his hand on the mic, looking down at the crowd. No laptop, no notes, everything he needed to say. He had carried inside him for years. "I shouldn't have to prove I'm harmless just to be left in peace," Marcus began, his voice low but clear. "No one should." 6 minutes ago, no one stirred. Those who had shared their stories sat silently, listening. Dean, seated toward the back, lifted his head, as if trying to predict what Marcus would say next. Marcus continued. "When I walked into Maple and Grain that day, I was just a customer, but within minutes, I became a suspect in a script I didn't write. And when I put my badge on the table, suddenly I became legitimate. Same man, just a different card. If that doesn't make us question how we see each other, then nothing will." 5 minutes ago, he paused, letting the words settle. "I heard your stories yesterday and today. I heard the boy ask, how do I stop them from doubting me just because I look like my dad? I wish I had an answer ready. But the truth is, I don't. I asked myself that same question when I was his age, and I hate that a new generation still has to ask it." 4 minutes ago, Marcus turned toward the boy sitting close to his mother, eyes still wide. "You shouldn't have to do anything to be left in peace. It's on us, the adults in this room, to do our part so you don't have to ask that question again." 3 minutes ago, a single clap broke the silence. Then more followed. Not loud, but steady. Marcus didn't raise his hand to stop them. He let the applause ring, an acknowledgement that what he'd said belonged to more than just him. 2 minutes ago, he gave a faint, bitter smile. "Some people say I've become a symbol, but if I'm a symbol of anything, I hope it's a reminder that people must matter more than titles, and that presence should never require permission. No time left." And if anyone thought Marcus was speaking just to close this chapter, they were wrong. His words were about to force many in that room to rewrite the stories they told themselves. A small hand went up in the middle rows. Not high, not assertive like someone eager to debate, but just enough to draw everyone's attention. It was the boy from the night before, his big dark eyes locked on Marcus as if pulling him closer. "Mister," he said, voice shaky but unbroken, "how do I stop people from looking at me like they look at you?" No one in the room breathed right away. Adults shifted in their seats, some looking down to avoid each other's gaze. It wasn't a question for Marcus. It was for the entire room and for countless others beyond it. But the boy had aimed it at him. Marcus swallowed hard. He saw himself at 12, standing in his yard asking his mother, "What do I have to wear so they don't think I'm dangerous?" He remembered her weary eyes that knew the answer but never wanted to say it out loud. He smiled faintly, sadly an expression he didn't much like. "You shouldn't have to ask that question," Marcus said, his voice dropping more like a confession than an answer. The boy blinked, waiting. Marcus continued, "But until people learn to see differently, remember this: you have the right to exist. You don't need to prove yourself to belong. You're not a reflection of someone else's prejudice. You are you." A sniffle came from the back row. A woman covered her mouth. An older man nodded slowly, as if Marcus had just spoken the words they'd been too afraid to say for years. Marcus bent slightly to meet the boy's gaze, and if anyone makes you forget that, remember the fault isn't yours. It's in how they've been taught to see you. The room stayed silent, but it no longer felt as suffocating. It was the silence of people processing an uncomfortable truth that sometimes the answer for a child doesn't lie in him, but in the willingness of adults to change themselves. A man in the corner murmured, "That kid just asked for all of us." Nods rippled through the room. Marcus didn't respond. He let that thought spread like a quiet command. It's time to relearn how to look. And if anyone thought his words were just to comfort a child, they'd soon realize Marcus had placed the burden on the entire town and everyone listening to rewrite the story they told themselves about justice. Marcus scanned the room from the podium. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt his gaze land on them. "I'll leave you with this," he said, voice steady, not loud but strong enough to carry. "If I hadn't put that badge on the table that day, you wouldn't have heard this story. I would have been just another black man told to leave a café, one of thousands of stories that never make the news. And that's the hardest truth. We only listen when there's a card, a title, a reason to think, 'Oh, this person deserves to be here.'" He paused. The air thickened. "But I don't want respect because I work for the federal government," Marcus said, his tone lower now, heavier. "I want respect because I'm a human being. And I want that for everyone in this room, including the boy who asked me how not to be seen as a problem." Slow nods here and there, no words. Marcus stepped away from the podium, no longer needing the mic. "So, I'll leave you with one question. When someone walks into a room, what story do you write about them before they've said a single word?" Silence. Not the kind demanding an immediate reply. The kind that lingers when people realize they already know the answer but don't want to say it. The kind that makes those who've shared their own stories of being scrutinized wonder, "Whom have I scrutinized?" The kind that forces officers in the back row to ask, "How many times have I let my instincts define someone before I asked a single question?" Marcus let his gaze sweep the room once more, making sure his question didn't die in the air. "I don't need an answer tonight. But if you leave this room still writing the same old stories, then everything we've done here today will mean nothing." He said nothing more. He didn't call for applause. He didn't wait for praise. He stepped down, returning to his seat like an ordinary man, leaving his question to echo against the pale yellow walls of the community center. No one moved. No one wanted to break the weight of that moment with the scrape of a chair or hurried footsteps. And if anyone thought this meeting was just about closing a case, they were wrong. Marcus's question wasn't meant to end anything. It was meant to begin, and it would follow each person out of that room like a mirror they couldn't avoid. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.